Most people who imagine surviving a brutal winter think about firewood. They think about thick walls and wool blankets, about the number of cords they managed to split before the first hard freeze. They think about the stove in the middle of the room and whether it will hold through the night. But there is something they never think about, and this is the thing that killed 340 people in the Northern Territories during the winter of 1886. They never think about the ground beneath their feet. They never think about what the earth itself can do when a human being is wise enough or desperate enough to ask it for help. This is the story of a woman who asked and the earth answered. Deborah White stood at the edge of her claim on a September afternoon in 1884, 31 years old, alone, and in possession of exactly 47 acres of unbroken prairie in the northeastern corner of Dakota Territory. The settlement of Grafton lay 11 miles to the southwest, close enough to reach in half a day with a good horse, which she did not have. What she had was 2 daughters, a milk cow named Clover, 3 hens that had already begun to slow their egg production with the shortening days, and a debt of $92 owed to Richard Miller, the dry goods merchant in town who had extended her credit through the summer, with the patience of a man who had already begun calculating what her land might be worth when she failed to repay him. The land itself was good land, rich dark loam that ran 18 to 24 inches deep before giving way to dense clay subsoil. Her husband Thomas had broken 16 acres of it in their first 2 seasons back when he was alive, and the future looked like something other than an endless series of problems that needed solving before the next problem arrived. Thomas White had died of a ruptured appendix in the spring of 1883, 2 days after the pain began, and 1 day after it became clear no doctor could reach them in time. He was 34 years old. He had built their sod house himself, dug the well, and left Deborah with all of it when he was gone. The neighbors did not expect her to stay through the winter. Timothy Clark, who held the claim a mile and a half to the east with his wife Cynthia and their 4 children, had told her plainly in September that she ought to take the girls and go back to Minnesota, where her sister lived. He said it without cruelty, standing at the edge of her yard with his hat in his hands, genuinely believing what he was saying. "There's no shame in it," he'd said. "A woman alone with 2 children this far out, with what's coming." Deborah had thanked him for his concern. She did not go. What Timothy Clark did not know, what none of the neighbors knew, was that Deborah White was not simply a widow with $92 of debt and too much stubbornness. She was the daughter of a man named Jonathan Wright, who had spent 40 years building things in the Gudbrandsdalen Valley of central Norway before emigrating to America in 1871. A man who had learned as a young apprentice under a master builder named Olav Gresseth, a technique so old and so practical that it had simply been forgotten by the people who no longer needed it. Richard Miller had other ideas about what Deborah White ought to do. He arrived at her farm on a Thursday afternoon in mid-September, driving his wagon with the careful precision of a man who did everything with careful precision. 45 years old, widowed himself 2 years prior, prosperous in the way that merchants in small frontier towns could be prosperous when they were the only source of necessary goods within 20 miles. He tied his horse to the fence post and walked to where Deborah was working in the yard, banking dirt against the south wall of her sod house in preparation for winter. "Mrs. White," he removed his hat, "I wanted to discuss your account." She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Of course, Mr. Miller. With the interest that's accrued over the summer, You're at $92 now." He said it matter-of-factly without malice. "Spring planting took most of what you had, I imagine." It did. "And you'll need seed again come April." "I will." He turned his hat in his hands, looking out across her land as if appraising it. "Mrs. White, I'm going to make you a proposal, a practical arrangement. You need protection out here. Resources. I need a household manager. Your debt would be forgiven entirely." The words hung in the air between them for 3 full seconds before Deborah understood what he was proposing. Marriage. Not love, not companionship, but a transaction. Her land and her labor in exchange for the erasure of debt and the respectability of having a husband again. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Miller." The words came out steady, which surprised her, given how her heart was hammering. "But I manage quite well on my own." His eyes narrowed just slightly. "We'll see how well you manage come February, Mrs. White." He climbed back into his wagon and drove away without another word. Deborah stood in her yard for a long time after he left, looking at the dirt she'd been piling against the wall, thinking about what he'd said and what he hadn't said. Miller was not a cruel man, but he was a calculating one, and men like that did not make offers they expected to be refused. Inside the sod house, her daughters were cleaning up from the midday meal. Catherine, 9 years old, serious and observant in the way that oldest children often are when circumstances force them to grow up faster than they should. Everyone called her Kate. Pamela, 7, still young enough to cry when frightened and to believe that problems could be solved if you just tried hard enough. Pam had her father's optimism. Kate had inherited something else entirely. "Mama, who was that?" Kate stood in the doorway drying her hands on a cloth. "Mr. Miller, from the store. What did he want?" "To talk about money." Kate's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. "Are we going to lose the farm?" "No." Deborah said it with more certainty than she felt. "We're not going to lose anything." That night, after the girls were asleep, Deborah pulled out the brown-paper drawings her father had made for her 4 years earlier, in the summer of 1880, the last time she had seen him alive. Jonathan Wright had been 61, then still strong, but beginning to move with the careful deliberation of a man who had stopped taking his body for granted. They had sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse outside St. Paul, and he had drawn the cross-section of a structure the way an engineer might draw a bridge, with measurements and notes and small arrows indicating the direction of airflow. She spread the drawings on her own table, now in the dim light of a single candle, and read her father's handwriting for what must have been the 100th time. 8 feet deep from surface grade, 10 feet long, 7 feet wide. Ceiling timbers, 6 inches in diameter, laid across the full width. 12 inches of straw, 18 inches of tamped earth above that. 1 ventilation shaft at 45 degrees, 1 entrance through a concealed trapdoor, and at the bottom of the page, in her father's careful script, the earth below the frost line maintains a temperature of 40 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the air above it is doing. This is not theory, Margaret. This is fact. He had called her Margaret, her given name, the one no one else used anymore. She thought about Thomas, about the way he had looked at her 2 days before he died, when the pain was already beyond bearing, but he was still trying to be strong about it. "The land is good, Maggie," he'd said, his voice tight with pain. "Don't let them take it. Promise me." She had promised, and now Richard Miller wanted her to break that promise, to trade her land and her independence for the security of being Mrs. Richard Miller Merchant's wife, respectable and protected and entirely powerless. Deborah folded the drawings and put them away. Then she went outside and stood in the dark yard looking at the woodshed that leaned against the north wall of her sod house. 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, dirt floor roof of rough-cut planks covered in tar paper. It already held most of her winter's wood supply, 3.5 cords of cottonwood and green ash that Kate had helped her stack through September. The woodshed was invisible from the road. It faced north, which meant no passing traveler would look at it and see anything unusual. That was precisely why she chose it. The first week of October, Deborah White began to dig. She started early before the sun was fully up, working in the half-light while the girls still slept. She pulled the stacked wood away from the north corner of the shed, moving it carefully so the outer appearance of the structure would not change, and then she started digging. The topsoil in that part of Dakota Territory was rich and dark, running 20 inches deep before giving way to pale gray clay mixed with fine gravel. She worked with a long-handled spade and a short trenching shovel, and she moved the excavated earth in a wheelbarrow 81 loads in the first 3 days, piling it against the south side of the sod house, where it would look like nothing more than a woman banking her walls against the coming cold. Which in a sense it was. Kate helped when she could, understanding, without being told that this was important, that silence was required, that Pam could not know yet, because Pam could not keep secrets. The younger girl would ask where Mama was, and Kate would say banking the walls, or checking the fence line, or any of a dozen small lies that sounded true, because they were almost true. Kate was good at this. Too good, probably. 9 years old and already learning to calculate what information was safe and what wasn't. On the 4th day of digging, Deborah's spade struck something that wasn't earth. She knelt and brushed the dirt away with her hands, revealing a fragment of old wood, hand-carved, the grain weathered, but still visible. It was a beam of some kind, maybe 8 inches long and 3 inches thick, clearly cut with tools but shaped in a way that spoke of careful craftsmanship. She dug around it carefully and found more pieces of what might have been a structure very old, and beneath one of the larger fragments, a small stone carved with symbols she didn't recognize. Not European, something else. Someone had tried to build something here before, long before. Someone who had understood, just as her father had understood, that the earth could be trusted when nothing else could. Deborah wrapped the carved stone in a piece of cloth and put it in her pocket. She told no one about it, but sometimes late at night she would take it out and run her fingers over the worn symbols and think about the people who had carved it, who had known things that most of her neighbors had forgotten or never learned. She reached the required depth of 8 feet on the 9th day of digging. She had moved in total approximately 5.1 tons of earth. Her back ached in a way that made it hard to turn over in her sleep, and her hands were covered in blisters that had broken and formed calluses and broken again. She was not complaining. She was calculating. The chamber was 10 feet long, 7 feet wide, 8 feet deep. The walls were vertical, cut cleanly into the subsoil. Everything matched her father's drawings exactly. The ceiling timbers presented the most significant challenge. There were no 6-inch round timbers readily available on the open prairie of northeastern Dakota Territory in 1884. What there was, if a person knew where to find it, was a stand of mature cottonwood trees along the course of a small creek that ran through the Clark claim to the east. Timothy had told Deborah in the spring that she was welcome to cut deadfall from that stand, and she had thanked him at the time without knowing precisely how she would use the permission. She cut 7 cottonwood poles on a cold morning in the second week of October when a hard frost had made the creek bottom firm enough to work on. Each pole was roughly 8 feet long and between 5 and 7 inches in diameter. She hauled them back to her claim on a sled, 2 poles per trip, using Clover the cow as her draft animal in the absence of a horse. The round trips covered approximately 3 miles each. She made 4 trips in 2 days. On the third day, Clover developed bloat. The cow's stomach distended with gas, her breathing became labored, and by mid-afternoon she was clearly in distress. If Clover died, Deborah would lose both her draft animal and her only source of milk. The chamber construction would have to stop. The family would have to survive on what they had, which might not be enough. Deborah spent that night in the barn with Clover, massaging the cow's stomach with firm, circular motions, forcing her to drink an herbal tea that Jonathan had taught her to make from wild mint and chamomile. Kate and Pam helped, taking turns rubbing Clover's flanks, learning without being told that this was what survival looked like. Long hours of patient work, refusing to accept that something vital was going to die just because dying was easier than living. By dawn, Clover's breathing had eased. By noon, the bloat had subsided. By evening, the cow was eating again cautiously, and Deborah was back to work on the chamber. Cynthia Clark came by the next afternoon, bringing a jar of herbal tincture and a concerned expression. "I heard Clover was sick. She's better now." Deborah accepted the jar. "Thank you for this." Cynthia looked past her at the dirt piled against the south wall at the wheelbarrow and the shovels at the woodshed with its door standing slightly ajar. "What exactly are you building under that woodshed?" "Deborah, insurance." The word came out before Deborah could think about whether it was wise to say it. "Just insurance, Cynthia." The other woman studied her for a long moment. "I judged you too quickly when Thomas died. I thought you'd leave. I thought you should leave." "A lot of people thought that." "I was wrong." Cynthia's voice was quiet but firm. "You're not reckless. You're remarkably prepared. If you ever need help, Deborah, Timothy, and I are here." "I know, and that means more than you realize." After Cynthia left, Deborah went back to the chamber. She laid the 7 cottonwood poles across the width of the excavation on October 14th, setting them into notches she had cut into the subsoil walls at the required depth, so that each pole rested with its full surface against the earth and could not shift or roll. She packed the gaps between the poles with strips of old burlap sacking soaked in water and allowed to freeze solid overnight. Her father had called this frost mortar. It would hold through the winter and could be cleared away in spring without damaging the timbers. Over the poles she spread straw, the last of a bale she had intended for Clover's winter bedding, supplemented with dry grass she had cut from the low ground near the creek. She spread it in an even layer across the full ceiling surface to a depth of 14 inches. Over the straw she replaced the excavated earth, tamping each layer with the flat back of her spade and the heel of her boot until the surface of the woodshed floor above the chamber was elevated by approximately 8 inches. Barely noticeable, easily explained by settling and debris if anyone asked. She spread wood chips over the disturbed area and restacked her firewood on top of it. The chamber was invisible again. Richard Miller came by on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. He stood in her yard watching as she worked on repairs to the water trough and made small observations about the weather, about the early frost, about how difficult it must be for a woman alone to prepare adequately for winter. He did not mention his proposal from September. He did not need to. The proposal was there in every word he spoke, in the way he looked at her dirt-stained hands and her worn dress and the stacked firewood and calculated how much longer she could possibly last. "Quite a lot of dirt you've moved, Mrs. White." He gestured at the pile against the south wall. "For simple banking. Quite a lot of winter coming, Mr. Miller." He smiled slightly. "Indeed. Well, I'll leave you to your preparations. My offer stands, of course. Should you reconsider, I won't." After he left, Kate came out of the house and stood beside her mother. "Is he going to take our farm, Mama?" "No." Deborah put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "He's going to try, but we're going to stop him. How? By being smarter than he is." That night, Kate asked the question she'd been holding back for weeks. "Mama, what are we building under the woodshed?" Deborah looked at her daughter, at this 9-year-old child who had already learned to lie, to protect secrets, who had spent nights rubbing a sick cow's belly, because the alternative was starvation, who had earned the right to know the truth. She pulled out her father's drawings and spread them on the table. "This is called a deep cellar. Your grandfather Jonathan taught me how to build it. It goes 8 feet underground below where the frost can reach. Down there, the earth stays warm, not fire warm, but warm enough. 45, 50 degrees even when it's 30 below outside." Kate studied the drawings with the seriousness of someone much older. "Why haven't other people built these?" "Because they've forgotten how, or they never knew. Your grandfather learned it in Norway, from men who learned it from their grandfathers going back hundreds of years. And we're going to use it this winter if we need to." Deborah folded the drawings. "But you can't tell anyone, Kate. Not Pam, not the Clarks, not anyone. Do you understand? Why not? Because people don't trust what they don't understand. And if they don't trust it, they'll find ways to dismiss it or undermine it. We can't let that happen." Kate nodded slowly. "I won't tell." The trapdoor frame went in on October 17th. Deborah had purchased the lumber 2x6-inch boards in Grafton back in August, ostensibly for repairing the house floor. It was exactly the kind of thing a widow with a deteriorating homestead might reasonably buy, and the merchant at the lumber yard had not commented on it. She cut the door from the same lumber, 2 pieces face nailed together for thickness with a recessed pull ring made from a bent nail and a short length of harness leather. When closed and covered with its scattering of dirt and wood chips, the trapdoor was completely invisible. She tested it 6 times before she was satisfied. Kate walked across the woodshed floor twice without detecting it. The ventilation shaft went in on October 19th. Deborah borrowed a long-handled auger from the Clark farm, telling Timothy she needed it to bore drainage holes through the base of her water trough, which was true and which she did before returning the tool. The shaft ran at 45 degrees through the north wall of the woodshed, emerging outside at a point 6 inches above ground level, angled so that its opening faced slightly downward and was partially shielded from direct wind impact. Her father had explained the principle in his notes. A shaft angled at 45 degrees with a slightly downward-facing opening on the cold side of the structure would use the Venturi effect of passing wind to draw stale air out of the chamber rather than forcing cold air in. In still conditions, the natural convection of warmer air inside would create sufficient upward draft to maintain ventilation. She tested it with a lit candle held at the base of the shaft inside the chamber. The flame bent steadily inward toward the opening. The draw was working. Before sealing the trap door for the first time, Deborah moved supplies into the chamber. 45 pounds of dried beans, 35 pounds of cornmeal, 12 pounds of salt pork wrapped in oilcloth, 14 quarts of preserved vegetables in sealed glass jars, a 6-gallon tin of lard, 2 wool blankets, a change of heavy clothing for each of them, a box of matches, 5 candles, the small oil lantern with 3 pints of lamp oil, and her father's drawings, along with his final letter, written in the autumn of 1881, 3 months before he died. She read that letter again by candlelight alone in the chamber before she climbed back up through the trapdoor and sealed it. The letter was worn from handling the creases deep, but the words were still clear. Dearest Deborah, if you are reading this when you need it most, know that I built you to endure. Not with words of comfort, but with knowledge that works. The neighbors will call you reckless. They always fear what they don't understand. Build in silence. Build with precision. The earth will prove you right when men cannot. Your loving father, Jonathan Wright. The first significant storm of the winter came in late December. 3 days of temperatures that never rose above minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds steady out of the northwest at 25 to 30 miles per hour. On the second day, when the temperature inside the sod house at mid-morning was 38 degrees and the stove was consuming wood at a rate that would exhaust her above-ground supply in less than a day. Deborah made the decision without drama or ceremony. She told the girls to put on their heaviest wool. She tied a rope from the house door to the woodshed door as a safety line in the blizzard. She led them across 12 feet of open ground in under a minute and lowered them one at a time through the trapdoor into the chamber. The temperature in the chamber when they entered was 46 degrees. Cooler than it had been during her tests in October, but still 2 degrees warmer than the standard ground temperature at that depth, which told her the passive thermal mass of the earth was already doing its work. She lit the lantern and hung it from a bent nail in one of the ceiling timbers. She pulled the trapdoor closed and seated the wooden locking bar across its underside. Then she settled herself against the stone wall with a wool blanket across her shoulders and Pam's head in her lap. "Mama, are we going to be all right?" Pam's voice was small and frightened in the enclosed space. "Yes," Deborah said it the way people say things when they know, not when they hope. Kate sat cross-legged on the floor, watching the lantern flame with the focused attention of someone trying to understand how things worked. "It's warmer down here than in the house." "It is, because we're below the frost line, because the earth remembers summer, even in winter." Within 2 hours, the lantern had raised the chamber temperature to 57 degrees. The hens in their crate in the corner were audibly calm, making the soft, contented sounds that chickens make when they feel safe. Deborah extinguished the lantern to conserve oil. By the following morning, with no heat source other than the thermal mass of the earth and the body warmth of the 4 of them, the chamber temperature had dropped to exactly 50 degrees. She lit the lantern again for 2 hours. It held at 55. She extinguished it. The storm above them continued for another 31 hours. They ate dried beans and cornmeal cooked over the lantern flame. They slept on the packed earth floor with wool blankets wrapped around them. They told each other the old stories that Jonathan Wright had told Deborah when she was young. Stories about the Norwegian valleys, where winter lasted 6 months, and people survived by understanding that the earth was older and wiser and more patient than any storm. When the blizzard broke on the afternoon of the third day, Deborah climbed out through the trapdoor into the woodshed, pushed the outer door open against the packed snow, and walked to the house to assess the situation. The stove was cold. The water bucket had frozen solid. The window had developed a crack in the lower left corner from the stress of the wind. None of this was a problem. She restarted the stove, melted water, and put on a pot of beans. The girls came up an hour later, warm and entirely untraumatized by their time underground. Kate immediately went to check on Clover. Richard Miller came by 2 days after the storm ended. He rode out from Grafton on his best horse, wrapped in a heavy coat and muffler, and found Deborah in her yard, splitting kindling for the stove. The girls were visible through the window, healthy and occupied with their lessons. The house chimney was producing steady smoke. Everything about the scene suggested a household that had weathered the storm without particular difficulty. Mrs. White. He dismounted and approached with the careful courtesy that barely concealed his surprise. "I wanted to make sure you'd come through all right." "We're fine, Mr. Miller, as you can see." "So I do." He looked around the yard at the woodshed, with its snow-cleared entrance, at the sod house with its carefully banked walls, at the healthy cow in the small barn. "You're quite resourceful." "I manage." Still, it must have been difficult. 3 days in that kind of cold, with only a sod house for shelter. "We stayed warm enough." He studied her for another moment, clearly trying to reconcile what he'd expected to find with what he was actually seeing. "Well, I'm pleased to hear it. My offer still stands, of course. Should you reconsider—" "I won't be reconsidering, Mr. Miller." After he left, Kate came out and stood beside her mother. "He thought we'd be desperate." "He hoped we'd be desperate." Deborah split another piece of kindling with a single clean stroke. "There's a difference." The winter of 1884 to 85 was cold, but it was not catastrophic. Deborah used the chamber only once more that season in late January, when she became ill with a severe chest cold and needed continuous warmth. She could not sustain above ground without burning through her wood supply at an unsustainable rate. They stayed below for 4 days while she recovered, and when they emerged, the world above was still frozen, but manageable. By spring, Deborah was the only homesteader within 6 miles who had not lost at least one animal to the cold. Timothy Clark had lost 2 pigs and a calf. Stephen Scott, the bachelor Norwegian, who held a claim 3 miles to the northwest, had lost 7 of his 8 sheep when his barn roof partially collapsed under snow load. The Thompson family, who had arrived from Wisconsin the previous spring and built a frame house with walls only 4 inches thick, had spent the last 6 weeks of winter living with the Clarks after their stove cracked. None of them knew about the chamber under Deborah's woodshed. None of them thought to ask how she had managed so well. What they thought, and this was the thing that people decide when they cannot explain a woman's competence, was that she had been lucky. Timothy said as much to Cynthia, who repeated it to Mrs. Thompson, who mentioned it to Deborah herself one afternoon in April, in the tone of friendly informing. That was the community's way of letting someone know what had been decided about them. "You were very fortunate this winter, Mrs. White." "The winter really wasn't so severe." "Was it?" Deborah thanked her for the observation and said nothing more. There was no point in arguing. The next winter, or the one after, would prove what luck had to do with it. In April, she went to Grafton and paid Richard Miller $22 toward her debt. He accepted the payment with barely concealed disappointment. "Mrs. White, I must admit surprise, though I wonder how much longer this independence of yours can last." "Long enough, Mr. Miller." She walked out of his store and did not look back. The summer of 1885 arrived with heat that seemed to rise from the earth itself, shimmering across the prairie in waves that made distant objects waver like reflections in disturbed water. Deborah spent the first weeks of June working the garden plot behind the sod house, coaxing vegetables from soil that wanted to crack and split in the relentless sun. Kate helped with the weeding, moving between the rows with the methodical efficiency she brought to everything, while Pam wandered the perimeter looking for wild strawberries that grew in scattered patches near the fence line. It was during one of these long June afternoons that Deborah made the decision to expand the chamber. Not because she doubted what she had already built, but because her father's notes contained references to features he had incorporated in the Norwegian structures that she had not yet attempted: the secondary alcove, the thermal mass wall, extensions that would make the difference between surviving and surviving comfortably when the worst conditions arrived. She began digging the alcove in the second week of June, working in the early mornings before the heat became unbearable. The new excavation extended off the eastern wall of the main chamber 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, connected by a low arched opening that required an adult to duck slightly when passing through. The work went faster this time. Her hands had hardened over the winter. Her body had learned the rhythm of the spade, the angle of leverage that moved earth with the least wasted effort. Kate turned 10 in July. Deborah marked the occasion by taking her daughter down into the completed alcove for the first time, standing together in the cool darkness beneath the woodshed with a single candle providing just enough light to see by. "You're old enough now to understand everything." Deborah's voice echoed slightly in the enclosed space. "Everything your grandfather knew, everything I've learned. This is yours now, too." She showed Kate the carved stone she had found during the initial excavation, the one with symbols that neither of them could read. People have survived winters this way for thousands of years. This isn't just Papa Jonathan's knowledge. This is human wisdom, Kate. Older than our towns, older than our churches. The earth teaches the same lessons to everyone willing to learn. Kate turned the stone over in her hands, running her fingers across the worn markings. "Will you teach me to build one someday when I have my own land? I'm teaching you right now." The alcove was designed as a stable annex for small livestock. Deborah built a low wooden manger against its far wall and covered the floor with 6 inches of clean sand over the packed earth. Her father's notes had been explicit about this. The original builders in Norway had routinely integrated chickens, small goats, even young pigs into their underground shelters during extreme cold. The animals provided additional body heat that could raise the chamber temperature by as much as 15 degrees, and the sand floor absorbed waste without creating the kind of foul air that would make the space uninhabitable. Clover was too large for the alcove, but the 3 hens were not. Deborah constructed a hinged crate that could be lowered through the trapdoor and positioned in the corner where the ventilation would be strongest. She added a second ventilation shaft in the alcove, mirroring the angle and construction of the first, drilling it through the north wall at 45 degrees so that passing wind would draw air out, rather than forcing cold air in. She cut a second smaller trapdoor in the woodshed floor directly above the alcove entrance, carefully concealing it with the same technique of scattered dirt and wood chips that had made the main door invisible. The thermal flywheel took longer to construct. Her father had called it that in his notes, though Deborah suspected the term was entirely his own invention and not something found in any engineering manual. The principle was simple enough. Stone, particularly dense sedimentary stone, absorbed heat slowly and released it even more slowly. A mass of stone maintained at ground temperature for months would continue to radiate stored thermal energy for 12 to 18 hours after the air temperature around it dropped, providing warmth without consuming fuel. She needed river stones, large ones, the kind that could be found in the creek bed that ran through Timothy Clark's claim, smooth and heavy from centuries of water flow. She made the first trip in late July, taking the wagon and explaining to Timothy that she needed stone for a project. He did not ask what kind of project. Men generally did not ask women to explain their domestic improvements, assuming that whatever a woman did around a homestead was both necessary and incomprehensible. Cynthia, however, was more direct. She met Deborah at the creek on the second trip, watching as Deborah loaded stones into the wagon bed with the careful attention of someone selecting materials for something specific. "What exactly are you building with all these river stones, Deborah?" The question hung between them for a moment. Deborah had kept the chamber secret for nearly a year, telling no one except Kate, protecting the knowledge the way her father had taught her to protect anything valuable until the world was ready to see it work. But Cynthia had proven herself different from the other neighbors. She had brought medicine for Clover. She had admitted to being wrong about Deborah's chances of survival. There was something in the directness of her question that suggested she could be trusted with at least part of the truth. "Keeping my family safe. That's all I can say for now." Cynthia studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I won't pry, but if you ever need help, Deborah, Timothy, and I are here. I mean that. I know, and that means more than you realize." She made 3 trips to the creek in total, hauling 52 stones, ranging from 8 to 20 pounds each. She stacked them along the western wall of the main chamber in an interlocking pattern that rose 4 feet high and extended 3 feet deep, leaving approximately 2 feet of working space between the stone mass and the center of the chamber. The pattern was important. Each stone needed to rest securely against the others, locked in place by its own weight, and the pressure from above creating a stable mass that would not shift even if someone leaned against it. The work took most of August. By the time she finished, her back ached in ways it had not ached even during the initial excavation, and she had developed new calluses on top of old ones on her palms where the stones had pressed and rubbed during the lifting and positioning. But when she stood in the chamber and looked at the completed wall, she knew it would work. The stone held the cool temperature of the earth against her palm when she touched it. In winter, heated by the lantern for a few hours, it would hold and slowly release that warmth through the coldest nights. She tested the system in early October on a morning when the temperature had dropped to 14 degrees and frost covered everything outside in a thick white layer. She heated the chamber for 2 hours with the lantern burning steady, then extinguished it and sealed the trapdoor. When she returned 12 hours later, the thermometer she had positioned at chest height in the center of the chamber read 51 degrees. Outside, the temperature had continued to drop and was now holding at 8 degrees with a wind that cut across the open prairie like something with teeth. Deborah went back to the house and started preparing supper, satisfied that when the real cold came, she would be ready for it. Kate had formed what could only be called a friendship with Daniel Clark Timothy and Cynthia's oldest son. He was 12, 3 years older than Kate, but the age difference seemed to matter less out on the frontier, where children grew into their responsibilities faster than they did in more settled places. Daniel had started teaching Kate how to set snares for rabbits that summer, showing her the places along the creek where the animals made their runs and how to position the wire loops so they would catch without allowing escape. Cynthia did not entirely approve. She mentioned it to Deborah one afternoon in September when she had come by to trade preserved vegetables, her voice carefully neutral, in the way that indicated she was trying not to judge while simultaneously judging. Kate's spending quite a bit of time with Daniel, learning things that most girls her age wouldn't need to know. She's learning to feed herself if she needs to. Deborah's tone made it clear this was not open for discussion. She's being raised to survive, Cynthia. There's a difference between that and being raised like a boy. Of course. Cynthia set down the jars she had brought. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise, but the comment had been made, and it sat between them like something that needed addressing. Deborah understood what Cynthia was really asking. Was Kate going to grow up strange? Was she going to become one of those hardened frontier women who forgot how to be soft, who lost the qualities that made them marriageable and respectable? It was a question born of genuine concern for what would happen to a girl who did not fit the expected pattern, and Deborah could not entirely fault Cynthia for asking it even indirectly. Kate will be fine, she'll be strong, and when the time comes, she'll know more than most women about how to keep a household running no matter what happens. Cynthia nodded slowly, accepting this, and when that time comes, Daniel will be lucky to have learned from her, I think. The comment surprised Deborah, but she did not let it show. The idea that Cynthia was already thinking about Kate and Daniel in those terms as future partners, rather than just children playing at adult skills, suggested that the Clarks saw Kate as someone worth investing in, rather than just the daughter of a widow who might not last another winter. Kate herself seemed unaware of any significance to the time she spent with Daniel beyond the practical knowledge being exchanged. She came home one afternoon in late September with 2 rabbits she had snared herself, cleaned and ready for the pot, and presented them to her mother with the kind of pride that came from accomplishment, rather than from impressing anyone. Daniel showed me how to find the fresh runs, the ones they're actually using, not the old paths. You look for the droppings and the bent grass. Deborah took the rabbits and nodded her approval. You did well. He says I'm better at setting the snares than his brothers. I make them tighter. That night, cooking the rabbit over the stove, while Kate and Pam worked on their evening lessons, Deborah thought about what her daughter was becoming. Not soft, certainly. Not like the daughters of more prosperous families who learned needlework and polite conversation and how to manage servants they would never actually have, but competent, capable of looking at a problem and finding a solution without waiting for someone else to do it for her. That was worth more than softness. That was what would keep her alive when being soft would get her killed. The autumn of 1886 arrived with signs that anyone who had lived through a hard winter would recognize. The squirrels were caching with unusual aggression, stripping the few oak trees along the creek of every acorn and burying them in scattered locations as if they expected a siege. The muskrats built their lodges thicker and higher than normal piling vegetation into mounds that rose well above the typical waterline. The early migrating birds, the ones that normally left in late September, were gone by the second week of the month, 2 full weeks ahead of their usual schedule. Deborah noticed all of these things and more. The ground froze hard in the first week of November, 3 weeks earlier than it had the previous year. The first snowfall on the 13th left a crust that did not melt even when the sun came out the following afternoon, and that crust did not soften. It stayed frozen and hard, a base layer that would only grow thicker as more snow accumulated on top of it. She began making preparations in the second week of November with the quiet deliberation of someone who understood that the margin between survival and death was often measured in small decisions made weeks before the crisis arrived. She moved an additional 35 pounds of provisions into the chamber. Dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork wrapped in fresh oilcloth, more preserved vegetables in jars sealed so tight they required a knife blade to pry open. She refilled the lamp oil tin to capacity, then added a second smaller tin as backup. She brought in another stone from the creek bed, a flat piece of dark shale that she wedged into the top tier of the thermal wall, increasing the mass by another 15 pounds. She re-examined every joint in the ceiling timbers, looking for cracks or separation in the frost mortar that had held through the previous winter. She found 2 sections that had dried and cracked over the summer's small gaps that would not have mattered in mild conditions, but could become problems if the temperatures dropped far enough for long enough. She replaced them with fresh packed clay mixed with just enough water to make it workable, pressing it into the gaps and smoothing it flat with her fingers. The hen's crate went into the alcove permanently. The birds seemed to understand that something had changed, that they were being relocated for reasons that had to do with survival rather than convenience. They settled into their new space with the adaptability that chickens possess, creatures that have lived alongside humans long enough to accept whatever arrangements humans decide are necessary. On the morning of November 17th, Deborah woke to a sky that looked like hammered iron, low and flat, and utterly without variation. The temperature had been dropping since midnight, and by dawn it was already at -12 degrees, with a wind out of the northwest that made the actual cold feel closer to -30. This was not unusual for Dakota territory in November. What was unusual was that the wind did not slacken as the morning progressed, and the temperature did not rise even slightly when the sun cleared the horizon. By noon, it was -15 degrees. The wind had increased to 30 miles per hour, steady and unrelenting. Snow began falling around 2 in the afternoon, not the large, soft flakes that accumulated gently, but small, hard pellets, driven horizontal by the wind, stinging anything they struck. Deborah kept herself and the girls in the sod house through that first afternoon and evening, feeding the stove carefully and watching the wood supply with the arithmetic she had developed over 2 winters of calculating exactly how much fuel she could afford to burn per hour. The house temperature at supper time was 42 degrees, not dangerously cold, but cold enough that their breath misted when they spoke, and Pam had to wear her wool coat while eating. That night the wind increased. Deborah lay awake, listening to it drive snow against the north wall of the house with a sound like sand being thrown against wood. The window creaked in its frame. The sod walls, 2 feet thick and built to withstand exactly this kind of assault, held firm, but she could hear the wind finding every small gap, every imperfection, whistling through in thin streams that made the candle flame dance, even though the candle was sheltered behind glass. By morning of the second day, the temperature inside the house at its warmest point directly beside the stove, was 38 degrees. The temperature in the sleeping area where the girls had spent the night was probably closer to 30. The water bucket had frozen solid overnight despite being kept near the stove. Outside, the thermometer that Deborah had mounted on a post near the door read -17 degrees, and that was just the air temperature, not accounting for the wind that made it feel exponentially colder. She did the calculation in her head while making breakfast over the stove. At the current rate of consumption, feeding the stove enough to keep the inside temperature even marginally habitable, she would exhaust her above-ground wood supply in approximately 20 hours. She could bring in wood from the main stack outside, but doing so would require repeated trips in conditions that were genuinely dangerous. Frostbite could set in within minutes in wind chill that severe. She could lose fingers. She could lose toes. She could lose her ability to work, which would mean losing everything else by extension. Or she could do what she had built the chamber to allow her to do. The decision took approximately 5 seconds. She told the girls to put on their heaviest wool clothing, every layer they owned. Kate moved immediately, understanding, without explanation, what was happening. Pam was slower, confused by the sudden urgency, needing Kate to help her with buttons and laces, while Deborah went outside to rig the safety rope. The rope was necessary because visibility in the blizzard was less than 10 feet. The woodshed was only 12 feet from the house door, but 12 feet in whiteout conditions with wind that could knock a person down was 12 feet that required a guideline to cross safely. Deborah tied one end to the door handle and fed the rope out as she moved toward the woodshed, leaning into the wind, feeling it try to push her sideways and off balance. Snow stung her face like thrown needles. By the time she reached the woodshed door and tied off the second end of the rope, she could not feel her fingers inside her gloves. She went back for the girls, Kate first gripping the rope with both hands, moving with the careful determination of someone who understood the stakes. Then Pam, who was crying before they were halfway across, terrified by the wind and the cold and the violence of it. Deborah got them both into the woodshed, then went back one more time to bring additional supplies, blankets, food, the Bible that Pam liked to have read to her before bed, the small carved wooden horse that had been Thomas's gift to Kate on her 8th birthday. Inside the woodshed, she brushed the snow off all 3 of them as best she could, then pulled aside the wood chips and dirt that concealed the main trap door. Kate helped her lift it. The warm air rising from below hit them like something physical, a presence that had weight and substance after the cutting cold outside. Down. Deborah's voice was steady despite the adrenaline singing in her blood. Careful on the ladder. She lowered Pam first, talking her through each rung until the girls' feet found the packed earth floor below. Kate went next, faster and more confident. Then Deborah passed down the supplies and descended herself, pulling the trapdoor closed above her and setting the wooden locking bar in place with hands that were starting to shake as the warmth brought feeling back into her frozen fingers. The temperature in the chamber was 46 degrees, cooler than it had been during her test runs in October because the thermal wall had not been preheated, but still warm enough that the contrast with the conditions above felt like a miracle. Deborah lit the lantern and hung it from the ceiling timber. Then she sat down against the stone wall with her wool blanket pulled around her shoulders and Pam curled against her side, shaking from cold and fear and relief. "Mama, are we going to be all right?" Pam's voice was muffled against Deborah's coat. "Yes." She said it the way she always said it, when she knew rather than hoped. Kate was already moving around the chamber, checking the supplies they had stored, organizing them in a way that made sense for however long they would need to stay below. She worked with the focused intensity of someone who needed tasks to manage fear, and Deborah let her do it, understanding that everyone had their own way of processing crisis. Within an hour, the lantern had raised the temperature to 54 degrees. Within 2 hours, it was 57. The hens in the alcove were making their soft, contented sounds undisturbed by the storm raging above them. Deborah extinguished the lantern to conserve oil. They had enough for perhaps a week if used carefully, burning it for 2 hours, then letting the thermal wall and their body heat maintain the temperature, then burning it again when needed. By evening, Kate had fashioned a meal from the dried beans and cornmeal, cooking it over the lantern flame in the small pot Deborah had brought down. They ate, sitting on the floor, the three of them in a circle, and after they ate, Pam asked Deborah to tell her a story. "Tell me about Grandfather Jonathan, the one about the winter in Norway when he saved all those people." Deborah had told this story before, but she told it again, now letting her voice fill the small space with images of a different time and place. Her father, young, then working under Master Gresseth in the valley, where winter lasted 6 months, and people either learned to survive or did not survive at all. The deep cellars they built into hillsides, structures that went down 10 and 12 feet, connected by tunnels holding whole families through blizzards that lasted weeks, the stone walls that held heat, the ventilation shafts that drew air without drawing cold, the knowledge passed down through generations because forgetting it meant dying. Did people believe him when he told them what he knew? Kate's question cut through the story direct and pointed. Some did, some didn't. The ones who didn't had to learn the hard way. What happened to them, some of them learned, some of them froze. It was a harsh answer, but Kate nodded as if it made sense to her, as if she understood that the world did not owe anyone understanding that knowledge had to be earned or inherited or stolen, and those who waited for it to be given freely often waited until it was too late. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Inside, 57 degrees and holding. The storm broke on the afternoon of the third day. Deborah knew it had ended not because the wind stopped entirely, but because its character changed from the sustained howl that had filled the chamber with a low, constant vibration to something more intermittent, gusting, and falling away in patterns that suggested the worst had passed. She waited another 2 hours before climbing up to investigate, leaving the girls below, with instructions to stay warm and stay quiet. The woodshed was thick with drifted snow that had found its way through gaps in the walls and the space beneath the door. The light coming through those gaps was the pale gray of late afternoon in winter, weak but present. She pushed the outer door open and had to shove hard against the packed snow on the other side before it gave way enough for her to squeeze through. The world above had been transformed into something alien and geometric. Snowdrifts rose in sharp-edged ridges, carved by wind, some of them reaching heights of 4 and 5 feet, completely burying the fence line on the north side of the property. The sod house was barely visible through the remaining snow that still fell in thin, scattered curtains, its dark walls providing the only contrast in a landscape that had been reduced to variations of white and gray. The thermometer read -8 degrees, not warm, not safe for extended exposure, but survivable for the short periods it would take to bring in more firewood, to check on Clover in the small barn, to begin the work of digging out and returning to something like normal function. She went back down and brought the girls up. Kate's first action was to head for the barn to check the cow. Pam stayed close to Deborah, still shaken by the violence of what they had experienced, needing the reassurance of proximity. They restarted the stove in the house, melted snow for water, and began the process of warming the space that had dropped to what Deborah estimated was somewhere near 15 degrees during their absence. Timothy Clark arrived 2 days later, walking the 1.5 miles from his claim in boots, wrapped with extra layers of burlap for insulation. He knocked, and Deborah let him in, noting the raw red patches on his cheeks where the cold had gotten through despite his muffler. "Came to check you were all right." His voice carried genuine relief when he saw the girls moving around the warm kitchen. "Storm was worse than I expected. We managed." He looked around the interior of the house, at the healthy fire in the stove, at the supplies visible on the shelves, at Deborah herself, who showed no signs of frostbite or exhaustion or the desperate scrambling that should have accompanied 3 days of extreme cold in a sod house. "Lost some wood when our shed wall buckled under the snow load. Spent most of yesterday trying to dig it out." "I'm sorry to hear that." "You seem to have come through better than most." He was not accusing, just genuinely puzzled. "House stayed warm enough." "Warm enough." After he left, Kate came to stand beside her mother at the window, watching Timothy's figure grow smaller as he walked back across the white expanse toward his own claim. "He doesn't understand how we did it." "No. Are you going to tell him?" "Not yet." Richard Miller came by 4 days after the storm, riding out from Grafton on a horse that looked as exhausted as its rider. He found Deborah splitting kindling in the yard, her daughters visible through the window, engaged in their lessons, the chimney producing the steady smoke of a well-maintained fire. His expression when he dismounted contained something new, not just the calculation she had grown used to seeing, but genuine confusion, mixed with something that might have been suspicion. "Mrs. White," he approached with exaggerated courtesy, "wanted to ensure you survived the blow. As you can see, we're fine." "So I do see." He let his gaze travel around the yard, taking in details. "Must have been quite an ordeal." 3 days of that kind of cold. We stayed warm in a sod house." He made it sound like a question that was not quite a question. "The walls are 2 feet thick, Mr. Miller. They hold heat better than you might think." He studied her for another moment, clearly unsatisfied with this explanation, but unable to articulate exactly what seemed wrong about it. "Well, I'm glad to hear it. My offer still stands naturally. Should circumstances change your thinking, they won't." After he rode away, Deborah went back to her kindling, but her hands moved more slowly now, her mind working through what Miller's visit meant. He had expected to find desperation, expected to find a woman who had burned through her wood supply and her resources and her options, who would be ready to accept any arrangement that promised survival. Instead, he had found competence and stability, and that discrepancy was going to make him more dangerous, not less. Men like Miller did not accept being wrong about women's capabilities. They doubled down. January of 1887 arrived with temperatures that made November's cold look temperate by comparison. The first serious storm of the new year came on the 9th, a system that settled over the northern plains and simply refused to move. By noon on that first day, the temperature at Grafton had dropped to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit and was still falling. The station agent, Edward Harris, recorded it in his daily journal with the kind of precision that comes from knowing such records might matter to someone trying to understand what happened later. Wind from the northwest at 47 miles per hour. Sustained, not gusting. The kind of wind that did not rest. In Grafton, cottonwood trees split from the cold with sounds like rifle shots. Ink froze solid in its bottles, even in heated rooms. A man attempting to walk the 2 miles from Grafton to Forest River was found 3 days later frozen in the position of someone who had simply stopped to rest and never started moving again. At the Clark Farm disaster arrived at midnight, when the north wall of Timothy's wood storage shed buckled under accumulated snow load and collapsed outward. The wall fell in sections, scattering split and stacked firewood across an area of open yard that the blizzard immediately buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. Timothy spent 4 hours in conditions that hovered near -40, trying to salvage what he could. Working by lantern light, refusing to accept that his family's heating fuel was gone, until Cynthia physically dragged him back inside. Both his feet were showing the white patches that precede serious frostbite. By morning, they had perhaps 6 hours of fuel remaining, maybe less. The temperature outside was -31 degrees and holding steady. Inside their house, even with the stove burning at maximum capacity, the temperature was dropping below 40 degrees. Their 4 children, the youngest, only 3 years old, were wrapped in every blanket and piece of clothing the family owned, and they were still shivering. Timothy made his decision at noon. He wrapped himself in a horse blanket, tied over his coat, bound his boots with strips of cloth to provide extra insulation, and walked out into conditions that could kill him in the time it took to cover 1.5 miles. The calculation was simple. If he stayed, his family froze. If he went and found help, they might survive. If he went and froze on the way, they would at least know he had tried. He did not tell Cynthia where he was going because she would have tried to stop him. He just kissed her and left. The walk took 45 minutes. Later, when people asked him to describe it, he would say only that there was a point about 20 minutes in when he stopped feeling his toes, and after that, the distance seemed to compress into a kind of white tunnel that had no measure except forward and not forward. He knocked on Deborah White's door with hands that had forgotten how to make a fist, and when she opened it, he looked at her for a moment, gathering the words from wherever words come from when most of you has shut down to conserve heat. "I need help." She pulled him inside without hesitation. "Come in and warm yourself. Then go back and bring your family." The words registered slowly, filtering through the fog of cold and exhaustion. "You want me to bring them here?" "Yes, bring everyone. We'll freeze on the way back." "No, you won't. Trust me, Timothy." Something in her voice made him believe it, though he could not have explained why. He drank the hot broth she gave him, warming his core enough to function, and then he went back out into the storm to retrieve his family. While he was gone, Deborah prepared. She went to the woodshed and opened both trapdoors, fully letting warm air rise from the chamber below. She rigged the rope guide from the house to the shed, anchoring it at multiple points so it could bear weight without sagging. She went down into the chamber and lit the lantern, then fed the small emergency stove she had installed the previous summer, heating the space as quickly as possible. She moved the hens to the far corner of the alcove to make room for more people. She spread the second wool blanket on the floor and positioned supplies within easy reach. Then she climbed back up and waited. The Clark family arrived 2 hours later, moving as a unit with Timothy leading and Cynthia bringing up the rear, the 4 children sandwiched between them. They followed the rope guide like people following a lifeline in a shipwreck, which, in a sense, they were. When Cynthia ducked through the woodshed door and saw Deborah standing there with the main trapdoor open and warm air rising from below, something in her face shifted from fear to confusion to the beginning of understanding. "How long have you had this?" Deborah met her eyes. "Since October of 1884. For a moment Cynthia did not speak. She looked at the open trapdoor at the ladder leading down at Deborah, who had built this thing in secret, and had kept it secret for more than 2 years, while her neighbors struggled through winters that this chamber could have made survivable. The question of why Deborah had not told anyone hung in the air between them, unspoken but present. "Would you have believed me if I had Deborah's voice was gentle but firm?" Cynthia's eyes filled with tears. "No, God help me, I wouldn't have." Then I saved us both the argument. The descent was awkward with 10 people, but they managed. Timothy went first, then helped the children down one by one. Cynthia came last, and when she straightened in the chamber and felt the ambient temperature wrap around her after 3 hours of walking, in conditions that had very nearly killed them all, she stood completely still for almost a minute, not speaking, just feeling. Kate showed the Clark children where to sit, how to position themselves near the thermal wall where the stone radiated its stored warmth. Deborah adjusted the lantern to burn at the optimal height, producing maximum heat without consuming fuel too quickly. Pam brought out the food supplies and began organizing a meal with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how it worked. The chamber temperature when the Clarks entered had been 48 degrees. Within an hour of having 10 people and the lantern burning it, rose to 54 degrees. By evening, with all 10 bodies contributing their warmth to the enclosed space and the stone wall radiating the heat it had absorbed from the lantern, the temperature reached 61 degrees. They stayed for 72 hours. The oil held, the provisions held, the ventilation system that Deborah had designed, based on her father's drawings, cycled air through the space without allowing cold to enter, and the candle she kept burning near the ventilation shaft never flickered even during the worst of the wind above. On the second morning, the hens laid 2 eggs. Kate announced this with an expression of quiet triumph that no one who was present would forget. Daniel Clark, 12 years old and old enough to understand what survival actually required, looked at Kate with something approaching awe and asked her quietly if she had known about the chamber the whole time. "Since last year. Mama taught me everything. Will you teach me? Maybe, if you can keep up." Stephen Scott arrived on the 12th of January, riding a horse he had kept alive by bringing it into his kitchen when the temperature dropped below -20. He had heard through the scattered network of frontier communication that the White Place had warmth and room, though he did not know the details. He tied his horse to the woodshed post and descended through the trapdoor that was no longer concealed because Deborah had stopped hiding it during the emergency. He sat on the chamber floor for 3 hours without speaking, except to remark once that it was warmer underground than in any house he had slept in all winter. The Thompson family arrived the following morning, having spent the worst of the storm with relatives in Grafton, but needing somewhere more sustainable now that those relatives were running low on fuel and space. Michael and Mary Johnson came the day after that, bringing their 3 children and a small pig that Mary refused to leave behind on the grounds that the animal would not survive another night in a barn that had already lost half its roof to snow load. She was correct about this, and no one argued. Gary and Angela Young. The elderly couple who had been living alone on their claim since their adult son took work in Fargo arrived on foot in the afternoon of the 15th. Angela was crying before they even reached the woodshed door, not from cold, but from the relief of having somewhere to go after days of believing they would freeze to death in their house when the wood ran out. At peak occupancy, the chamber held 16 people, 1 dog, 4 hens, and 1 small pig. The temperature never dropped below 48 degrees during this period, and during the warmest intervals, with all 16 bodies and the animals contributing heat in the enclosed space, it reached as high as 63 degrees. The thermal wall performed beyond its design specifications, holding and releasing warmth in a slow, steady cycle that required only intermittent use of the lantern to maintain comfortable conditions. The Earth, as Jonathan Wright had promised in his notes, did not panic. It simply did what it had always done, maintaining its temperature below the frost line, regardless of what was happening above, waiting with infinite patience for the storm to pass. Richard Miller heard about the shelter on the 18th of January from Edward Harris at the Grafton feed store. The station agent mentioned in passing that the white place seemed to be housing multiple families, that people were speaking of it as the warmest refuge in the county. Miller rode out that afternoon, despite the dangerous cold, his curiosity stronger than his caution. He found the woodshed and descended without asking permission, dropping through the trapdoor and straightening in the warm space below to find 16 people staring at him with expressions ranging from surprise to hostility. He looked around the chamber, taking in the stone wall, the ventilation shaft, the carefully organized supplies, the lantern burning steady, the structural soundness of everything Deborah had built. His face went through several calculations before settling on something that looked like admiration but carried the weight of opportunity. "Mrs. White," his voice filled the space with false warmth. "This is remarkable, quite remarkable." Deborah stood from where she had been sitting against the stone wall. "Mr. Miller, I don't recall inviting you down. Forgive the intrusion, but when I heard about this, well, I had to see it for myself." He turned slowly, gesturing at the chamber. "You've built something valuable here. Very valuable. I have a proposal." The room went quiet. Everyone present understood that whatever Miller was about to say would not be offered out of generosity. "I'll forgive your entire debt, all of it, $105 with the interest that's accrued." He paused for effect. "In exchange for half ownership of this structure, we'll operate it as a commercial refuge. Charge families $2 per day to shelter here during severe weather. You'll make far more than farming ever brought you." The words hung in the air for 3 full seconds before Deborah responded. Her voice, when it came, was colder than anything outside. "Mr. Miller, this shelter saved 16 lives. It was built with my father's knowledge, my hands, my work. It is not and will never be a business opportunity for you or anyone else. Then I expect full payment of $105 by April 1st, with additional interest. If you cannot pay, I will take this land and everything on it." "She won't be paying alone." Timothy Clark stood up from the other side of the chamber. "Every family here will help." Cynthia's voice was steady and certain. "Count me in." Stephen Scott nodded from where he sat. "And us." Michael Johnson spoke for his family. One by one, the others added their agreement. Angela Young crying again, but this time from something other than cold. The Thompson parents, Mary Johnson, all of them pledging money they did not have in comfortable excess, but that they would find because the alternative was allowing Richard Miller to take from Deborah White what she had built and what had saved them. Miller looked around the chamber at faces that had unified against him, and something in his expression shifted. Not defeat exactly, but recognition that he had miscalculated, that he had tried to exploit something that had already created a debt that ran deeper than money. April 1st, Mrs. White. He climbed back up through the trapdoor and was gone. After he left the chamber filled with a silence that felt less like absence and more like presence, as if something important had just been decided by people who understood that some things could not be reduced to transactions. Timothy spoke first. "You gave us our lives. Let us give you your land." Deborah's eyes filled with tears she had not allowed herself to shed through months of work and worry and careful preparation. She nodded, unable to speak. The storms broke in late February, not all at once, but in stages, the temperatures climbing slowly from the depths of January toward something that resembled normal winter rather than apocalypse. Families began leaving the chamber and returning to their own claims, digging out, assessing damage, beginning repairs. Cynthia was the last to go, holding Deborah in a long embrace before climbing up through the trapdoor. "You didn't just save our lives. You showed us what real strength looks like." The story of what Deborah White had built spread through Pembina County with the speed that genuinely useful knowledge always moves when people have recently been frightened. Fast, precise, carrying the weight of something that will not be forgotten. Timothy described the shelter to a group of men at the Grafton feed store in early March, calling it the most practical piece of building he had ever seen and announcing his intention to construct one himself before the following autumn, which he did with Deborah's assistance. Edward Harris wrote a 4-paragraph account in his daily journal on February 22nd, noting that the underground shelter had provided warmth and safety for no fewer than 16 persons during the extreme conditions of January last, and that it had been designed and constructed by a widow of 31 years working alone without assistance, and without apparent recognition of the difficulty she had undertaken. That journal survived. It rests today in the collections of the State Historical Society of North Dakota, cataloged under Frontier Homesteader accounts in a box that also contains a seed catalog from 1889, a child's drawing of a horse, and 3 letters in Norwegian that remain untranslated. By autumn of 1887, Deborah had paid Richard Miller the full $105. Part of the money came from the sale of 2 calves she had raised from clover. Part came from the modest sum Timothy Clark paid her for designing and supervising the construction of his own underground shelter. Part came from contributions pooled by the families she had sheltered, who refused to let her refuse their help. Miller accepted the payment with an expression that suggested he was reassessing everything he thought he understood about Deborah White. "Mrs. White, I underestimated you. That was my mistake." It was. She walked out of his store debt-free for the first time since Thomas had died, and she did not look back. The years that followed were not easy, but they were survivable. Deborah worked her claim for another 22 years, raising her daughters, expanding her garden, building a small but stable operation that proved a woman alone could manage if she had the knowledge and the will. Kate learned everything her mother knew about underground shelter construction and taught the method to 3 other women in the community before marrying Daniel Clark in 1897. They built a chamber together on their own land working side by side, and years later, their children would describe parents who had understood that survival was a skill to be learned rather than a circumstance to be endured. Pam became a school teacher in Park River. On particularly cold January days, she would tell her students the story of the winter. Her mother kept 16 people warm underground while the temperature above held at minus 38 degrees for 3 days. She always ended the story the same way, not with numbers or engineering details, but with a single image that had stayed with her for 60 years. An oil lantern burning steady in an 8-foot chamber beneath a forgotten woodshed on the northern plains, surrounded by 16 people with nowhere else to go, and the flame not flickering, not once, not even when the worst came, because the earth, when you go deep enough, does not shake. And a woman who knows that, and who builds accordingly, needs no permission from the cold. The knowledge Jonathan Wright had carried from Norway passed to his daughter, passed to her daughter, and to the women Kate taught, survived in scattered form through the generations that followed. Some of it was lost, some was written down in journals and letters that found their way into historical society archives. Some lived on in the practical wisdom of homesteaders who understood that the earth below the frost line maintained a constant temperature, and that this fact properly leveraged could mean the difference between death and survival. But the larger truth survived intact. That preparation is what the unprepared call luck. That competence in a woman will always be dismissed as fortune by those who cannot explain it. That knowledge moves fastest when people have been recently afraid, and that fear properly channeled creates memory that lasts. The chamber under Deborah White's woodshed was eventually filled in when the property changed hands decades later. The new owners, knowing nothing of its history, saw only a depression in the ground beneath a deteriorating shed and decided to level everything for new construction. The stones from the thermal wall were scattered, the ceiling timbers rotted and were cleared away. The trapdoor was burned with other scrap wood, but the story remained. Not because it was written in official histories or celebrated in public monuments, but because it was the kind of story that people needed to believe was true. That a woman could build something nobody thought possible. That knowledge could be more valuable than strength. That the earth would help those wise enough to ask. And because in the end, the story was true. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever prepared for something everyone said was impossible, then proved them wrong? That moment when competence is dismissed as luck, when hard work that others didn't witness becomes fortune they cannot explain. The margin between survival and death is often measured in decisions made months before the crisis arrives, in knowledge carried across generations, in the willingness to build what needs building even when no one believes it will work. Deborah White understood this. She understood that the world does not owe anyone understanding, that those who wait for permission often wait too long, and that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is prepare in silence and let results speak. The earth remembers. So should we.